So part 4, deep and surface structure power. So these ideas come from the Frost and Egri paper that I have up on Blackboard, but also from the Thompson and Purdy reading. So this is a little bit more complex, I suppose, but I want us to take just a little bit of even just a very, not superficial, but a very surface level kind of understanding of what this stuff means, because I actually think it's quite interesting. It can give us a different lens of thinking about how organisations operate. So Frost and Egri in their paper, they're the ones that I believe came up with this idea of surface and deep power structure. They differentiate between these different sorts of power structures. So first, if we think about the deep structure, this largely refers to, the way I think about it is the organisational culture of an organisation. But even deeper than that, it's thinking about what's the history of the organisation? Really, how are things done here? How have they always been done? What are some of the systems of influence? What are some of those ways of doing things that simply aren't questioned, that are just done, that people don't even think about it? That's the deep structure. So as I've got in that first little paragraph, or sentence there, I should say, deep structure is the values, it's the beliefs, it's the practices that underlie the surface characteristics. So this is how people create meaning in organisations. It's how they understand what to do in organisations. It's that kind of stuff that's unconscious. So it's like organisational culture in that way. People often don't think about this stuff, even when they're questioned about it. It's often when things go wrong or things happen that might have to shake how they understand how things are done in organisations, that actually go, oh, that's how we do things here. I'd never really thought about that before. I'd never really questioned it. So the lowest and most invisible level are the political strategies and tactics that emerge from the deep structure of the organisation. As I mentioned, because these are things that are embedded and implicit, they're based on history of the organisation. They shape how actors view what is possible and what is not possible. And I've got that in bold because, again, it comes back to this is hard to identify. But what is useful about thinking about this deep structure notion is that it tells us, what do people actually think they can do in organisations? What do they think they can't do? And why that's interesting for us from an innovation perspective is innovation is often about thinking about what aren't we doing? What aren't we doing well? What can we do differently? And so the deep structure can shape how people think about those things at their very essence. So there are a few different ways that we can think about deep structure if we move on from that. So a few different tactics or strategies that can derive, I suppose, from what we call this deep structure. So if you look at let me flick back here, Thompson and Purdy paper, they give some good examples of these types of tactics that can be used to influence the deep structure in the innovation process. So Frost and Egri talk about naturalization, neutralization, legitimation, and socialization. I actually have a paper by another author called Dietz that talks about these sorts of tactics in a little bit more detail. And you're free to contact me if you want to get access to that particular paper. I'm happy to give it to you. You've got enough readings, I think, in this module already. So 4 tactics that stem from the deep structure that individuals or groups of individuals can engage in to exert power and, I guess, engage in some political activity. Naturalization is really about saying this is the way that we do things, and we don't do things any differently here. So it's basically saying there's a certain way that stuff is done and we don't question it, and it's just like a natural law. So this is one of those things that people, you can see it's hard for people to identify what that stuff is. It's just taken for granted assumptions, I suppose, is one way to look at it. Again, I don't expect you to know these in detail, just have a bit of a sense of them. So neutralization is basically where individuals, can be managers, for example, might devalue alternative positions to leave only one dominant view. So, for example, where a manager might say to you, I just need you to give me the data on that. I just need you to give me some numbers and stats, go do a survey, give me some data on why that will work. So immediately what that does for this sort of neutralization tactic is say, well, and again it relates to naturalization, this is the way that we do things. If I want you to give me evidence, then I expect that evidence to be in numbers, I expect that evidence to be in a survey, and in order to influence me, I expect you to give me some data. So immediately that's devaluing different types of evidence that you can take to a manager to support your position. It's devaluing the fact that Maybe you could go and do interviews or collect more personal data from people, or use a different sort of influencing strategy, use a different sort of piece of evidence or different pieces of evidence. Basically, neutralization where somebody might say, this is the way we do stuff, and so there is no alternative way to look at this. My way is the best way, or the way that the organisation has always done this is the best way, and there's no other position that we will take. So that's neutralization. Legitimation is where, similar to legitimating influence tactic that we talked about in the module on influencing strategies and tactics, legitimation is basically using a higher order to justify the status quo or the way that we do things. So again, it relates to naturalization and neutralization. You might say, well, in this policy, it says that we do this, and maybe we've always done it this way, so that's how we're going to do it now. So keeping things as they are, keeping the status quo, insisting on no change. And socialization, hopefully you've a term you've used before, when individuals come into organisations, they're what we call socialised. They go through a process of socialisation where they're kind of taught by others in the organisation, and also through organisational documents and inductions and all those sorts of things. How the organisation operates, how we do things around here, all of that kind of stuff. So it's another tactic that can be used to reinforce the deep structure, power systems and arrangements in organisations. I'll let you go through the Thompson and Purdy paper, but this table 3 I think is particularly interesting because it actually gives some examples of what these deep structure characteristics and tactics and strategies that can be used in organisations. So have a look at those. It's a university focus, so hopefully one then that you might be a little bit familiar with. And again, I think table 2 is important as well. So here you can see they give a bit of a continuum of surface versus deep structure tactics and strategies that can be used. So you can see down the bottom in terms of deep structure, they talk about those 4 tactics that we just talked about there. And the aim there in terms of political strategy is gaining or preserving sectional interests. And you get to see some of these sort of strategies as we get more to the surface level of things that are more overt, more easily seen. Some of those tactics and strategies that Mintzberg talks about, lauding, sponsorship, etc. So that's the deep structure. It's the stuff that's difficult to see that lies really at the heart of how organisations operate. So let's quickly look at what surface structure looks like. Now, a colleague of mine actually nicely, I think, provided a visual for how we can think about deep versus surface structure. So she suggested that the way you can visualise this, and I'm the sort of person that likes to be able to see pictures in my head to understand things. So if you're like that too, one picture you can have in your head is of a house sitting on brick pylons. Now, when you're up in the house, you can see everything that's going on. It's pretty open. You can see how people operate. Nothing much is hidden. That's like surface structure power. That's what's out in organisations. You see how people interact. You see how people talk to each other. You can see the sorts of games they play. It's fairly open whether it's constructive or destructive games. Deep structure power, to understand that, you really need to get in under that house. You need to get into where the brick pylons are, get out the front door, get underneath the house, and that is where the deep structure lies. It's stuff that you can't see so well. It's pretty hidden. It's implicit, so you don't really see it, but it's there, and that's what holds up the house. And so that's what's holding up the surface structure. What's actually going on in organisations is that deeper stuff, that cultural stuff, the historical stuff that defines an organisation and how it operates and how it does things. So hopefully that's a little visual you can use when we're talking about these sorts of things. So surface structure, as I mentioned in that little example there of the house. So it's more readily accessible. It's easier to see this stuff in action. So surface politics involves the overt and direct exercise of power and influence over others in order to achieve a person's goals. So a lot of this relates to the games that Mintzberg talked about. If you go into an organisation, if you spend a little bit of time in there, it'd probably be fairly easy to see, okay, are there rival camp games going on? Are there strategic candidate games going on? Are there lauding games going on? Those are all surface political activities, okay? They're fairly easy to see and they're out in the open. And just as I've got there, so like Mintzberg's games, they're often focused on gaining, maintaining, withholding the context or frame of reference in organisations. So often it's about gaining, maintaining power, alliance building, coalition building, all of those sorts of things. So I also just want to very briefly mention that surface structure political games can be competitive and they can be collaborative. So obviously one's, I guess, got a more destructive tone to it and one's got more of a constructive tone to it. So I'll let you go through these points yourselves. Basically, competitive games are some of those more destructive ones that Mintzberg talks about: insurgency, counterinsurgency, rival camps, those sorts of things. Whereas political activities that are more about negotiation, bargaining, coalition building, etc., are often more collaborative, and I'll talk a little bit about those in that last stop point there. But just to know, again, it's that duality. So there can be pros and cons to political activity. When we're looking at the surface structure power, so the stuff that's out in the open, we can start to categorise these games as being more competitive or more collaborative. And lastly, although I don't expect you to know about this in depth, but this might be a political tactical strategy that you've heard of or that you've seen in play. It's asking for forgiveness or seeking permission. And I'm pretty sure I've heard our previous Prime Minister, Tony Abbott, use the asking for forgiveness political tactic when he's basically gone after and sought to implement his own policies without necessarily the full backing of his party. So what we know is that for product and administrative types of innovations, these types of games can come into play. So asking for forgiveness is often more associated with product innovations. This is where an innovator might actually get to a point of having prototyped a product or a service, really worked it through, got it to a point where it's going to be adopted, and that hasn't actually been sanctioned or explicitly identified to senior managers or any managers in the organisation. And so they've gone ahead and they've done this and maybe used some organisational resources to do it, but they thought it would be a really great idea and it would have really good outcomes. That's asking for forgiveness. You get to the point where it's like, okay, hi everyone, here I am at your senior management team meeting and I've done all this work and used all these resources and here's what I want to present you with, and let's just get this out and let's just get it selling, let's get it adopted. So it's asking for forgiveness for stuff that you've already done. Seeking permission is often associated with administrative innovation. So these are ones that often require a more public approach, where you need to build coalitions and alliances with others, where you might need to get the sponsorship of others. You might need to borrow the power bases of other individuals. And so you seek permission at each stage that the innovation is being developed in order to push it through the organisational system. So let's take a break and then we'll come towards our final sections around organisational power and structure.